All right, welcome back to ABA exam review in our continuation of our BCBA task list series. Today we're continuing with concepts and principles, rule governed and contingency shaped behavior, which is B13. So we're going to focus mainly on rule governed behavior. We typically work with contingency shaped behavior because we're constantly setting up consequences and delivering consequences and trying to get behavior to contact more natural consequences that are going to either increase, decrease, or change the behavior. Rule governed behavior differs in that there's a verbal stimulus that is stating the behavior and stating the consequence, but that consequence doesn't necessarily play out. So a rule is almost as if you're setting up a contingency. If you do this, then you do this, but the contingency doesn't necessarily occur, and yet the behavior still happens over and over again. Once that contingency actually plays out, then it becomes a contingency shaped behavior. As always, check out behavioranalyst.study.com for our combo pack and other study materials. When you pass, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. Let's get going. Rule governed and contingency shaped behavior. Let's start with rule governed behavior. So rule governed behavior occurs when a verbal stimulus evokes behavior, alters MOs, or specifies a consequence of behavior. So typically a rule is going to state maybe an antecedent and a response and a consequence. So it's setting up the scene for how our behavior should look and what happens if that behavior does or doesn't look like that. Typically, we think of a rule as more of a negative thing, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It's simply specifying if you do this, this is going to happen. And it's a verbal stimulus. Now, remember, there's a difference between verbal and vocal. Vocal can be spoken, right? It's a vocal rule. But verbal can also mean a sign language, picture cards. So all these things are stating what a behavior is, what's going to happen if that behavior occurs. Now, rule governed behavior is sometimes referred to as instructional control because simply stating the behavior and what's going to happen if the behavior does or doesn't happen is enough to control that behavior. So, for example, rules can come from other people. Don't eat dessert before dinner or you will spoil your dinner. Now, don't eat dessert before dinner, of course, is the specified behavior. The consequence is you will spoil your dinner. Now, even if you've never done this before, your behavior is still changing due to the specified consequence of that behavior. Now, same thing from rules can come from the environment, right? So if we look at a sign, do not stick your hand in the cage, animals may bite. There's a strong chance that if you're at the zoo and you see this sign, you've never stuck your hand in the cage before, you've never seen someone stick their hand in the cage before, but you don't stick your hand in the cage regardless, even though you've never been bitten. The rule is what is controlling your behavior. If you do stick your hand in the cage, you're going to get bitten. So the rule is telling you, don't stick your hand in the cage. Animals may bite. So there's your behavior and there's your stated consequence. And then rules can come from yourself. I must keep the house clean or my children would get very sick. So you're telling yourself, I've got to clean the house over and over and over again, or my children are going to get very sick. Even if this has never occurred before, ever, there's no contingency in place. The rule is telling you what's going to happen if you do or don't do the behavior. So that's really the key. There's a stated behavior that should be evoked. There's a stated consequence or outcome for that behavior. And there's never been any strong contingency in place as far as reinforcement, punishment, or extinction goes. That rule is simply controlling the behavior in the absence of a true consequence. So the rule in rule governed behavior is that the verbal stimuli, the physical stimuli, the consequence stimuli, or D, none of the above. What's going to be the verbal stimuli? The verbal stimuli states the rule and the behavior changes as a result of that rule. So let's look at some key factors or key ideas behind what makes a rule. Now, all these might not be present, but it's typically what you're looking for when a rule is in place. So rule governed behavior is controlled by, again, a verbal statement of an ABC contingency. If you do this, then this is going to happen. Now, that sounds very similar to a contingency shaped behavior. Remember, the main difference is that contingency never actually really plays out. There's never really a consequence that happens. Okay, so no immediate consequence is apparent. I tell you, don't stick your hand in the cage. because you'll get bit. Now, if you stick your hand in the cage, there's also a good chance you're not going to get bit. So there's really no immediate consequence that is apparent or that even happens because you're just following the rule. You don't stick your hand in the cage regardless, even though no contingencies ever shaped that behavior. It's simply the verbal statement that is shaping the behavior. And that's the big difference. The verbal statement alone is enough to control the behavior. Contingency shaped behavior, now we've actually got consequences in place, or the response consequence delay is greater than 30 seconds. So the response occurs and it's way in the future where consequence actually happens. Remember, contiguity, closeness of a consequence is important. Behavior changes without reinforcement. So in the case of a teacher telling the class to not talk during an exam, and they don't, even though she doesn't reinforce the behavior, she doesn't give a consequence for the behavior, the rule is strong enough to where the behavior continues to change, right? Kids don't talk, even though there's never been a contingency that shaped that behavior. A large increase in the occurrence of behavior occurs following a single instance of reinforcement. So same example, the teacher says, don't talk during the exam. And the first time nobody talks, she rewards them, but never rewards them again, and yet the behavior maintains. So there's a huge increase in the occurrence of the specified behavior, even though there might be a single instance of reinforcement. Again, that rule is still in place, and it's enough to control that behavior without a true consequence. And then no consequence for the behavior exists. So there's no consequence at all, right? That behavior happens regardless. Beware of alligators. Well, you've never been bitten by the alligator. There's no real consequence in place for that rule, but you continue to beware regardless because the rule is telling you to beware, even though no consequences ever existed for not bewaring of the alligator, or more or less, right? So the idea really is more so the verbal statement is controlling the behavior rather than the contingency or the consequence. So if we look at contingency shaped behavior, now we're actually shaping behavior with the direct experience with that contingency. So sometimes referred to as contingency selected behavior. So if you get in a situation where I tell you don't eat dessert before dinner because you'll spoil your dinner, but then you go ahead and eat dessert and your dinner gets spoiled, now you've actually come into contact with that contingency, right? Because you've actually engaged in the act of eating the dessert and spoiling your dinner. So now it's contingency shaped. So contingency shaped is simply saying there are now active consequences in place, right? There's a direct experiences with all these consequences that are now maintaining the behavior. It's not the rule alone. There's now been a contingency in place for shaping the behavior. So a lot of times contingency shaped behavior comes from breaking that rule, right? Don't swim 30 minutes after you eat or you'll get sick. If you go ahead and swim anyway, right, and you get sick, now it's contingency shaped. Because remember, don't swim and you not swimming, okay, is not really engaging in a response, okay? You're just not doing what you're not supposed to do based on that rule, all right? So the contingency could be reinforcement, it could be punishment, shaping, extinction, all of these interventions that affect behavior through contingencies, right? If you do something good, you're reinforced. If you do something we want to decrease, punishment is delivered. We shape behavior through reinforcement. We provide differential reinforcement extinction. All these are examples of contingencies. There's active consequences occurring for the responses rather than just a verbal statement of what's going to occur if the behavior does or doesn't happen. So the contingency statement of if then or first then, right? If you do your homework, then you get a cookie. Now to make this a contingency, what needs to happen? Well, you have to get a cookie, right? That's what makes it a contingency, okay? So if it says if you do your homework, then you get a cookie and you never get that cookie, but you continue to do your homework, well, then that's more of a rule because there's no actual contingency shaping the behavior. So which of the following is an example of a rule? A, after you do your chores, we will go shopping. you do your chores, then shop. So your behavior is contacted this contingency. Okay, so there's contingency shaped behavior. B, do your chores, or you cannot play with your friends. You don't do your chores, so you could not play with your friends. Again, you engage in the response. There's a consequence. There's an actual contingency in place. C, all good boys do their chores. This is saying if you do your chores, then you're a good boy. There's no immediate consequence apparent. There's no immediate contingency apparent. But if the chores are done, then allegedly you're going to be a good boy, whatever that means. So C is simply the rule stating if you do your chores, you're a good boy. No consequence required. And then D, if you do your chores, you can have extra dessert. You did your chores, then you ate an extra cookie. So that's the cookie example. You actually engaged in the response, and there was a consequence waiting for that response, which is then going to change the future behavior. So the rule is C. All good boys do their chores. So the implication, do your chores, you're going to be a good boy, even though there's no real consequence in play. There's no immediate contingency apparent. You're still going to do your chores because you're a good boy. You're following the rule. All right. So that is rule governed and contingency shaped behavior. Essentially, when you're thinking of rules, think of this verbal stimuli is stating some sort of ABC contingency, right? Some ABC contingency, but the contingency is never actually really playing out. Okay, I think that's the big takeaway here. The rule states essentially the ABC sequence, essentially a contingency, but the contingency never actually plays out, and yet the behavior is still evoked consistently. With contingency-shaped behavior, there is a consequence in place. Consequences are playing out. Consequences are changing the behavior. All right, check out behavioranalyst.study.com for all of our study materials, including our combo pack. As always, when you pass, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout-out. Work hard, study hard. See you soon.